So we're going to have a smooth transition to our next panel discussion, which is examining world views towards the battle of giants. And for that, I would like to welcome our distinguished panelists. First of all, Peter Schultz, professor at the University of Göttingen and co-founder of the DOC Research Institute. Please take a seat. Bruno Massage, he's the former Portuguese Minister of European Affairs and author of the bestseller The Dawn of Eurasia, On the Trail of the New World Order. Sergei Markedonov, leading researcher of the Euro-Atlantic Security Center of the MGIMO Institute for International Studies. Wang Huiyao, founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization and then Dhruv Khatoj, director of the India Foundation. Over here, please, sir. And then we have Mr. Richard Sakwa. He's professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent and also an associate fellow of the Chatham House. Thank you so much, gentlemen. First of all, I would like to ask the audience actually a short question and to take the temperature of the room. Who in this room thinks that we are moving towards the battle of giants? Who thinks that? Raise your hand. Just about 10 people, I would say. Who thinks we do not move towards the battle of giants? The room is about half-half. Okay, so let me actually start with Professor Schultz. What do you think? Are we moving towards the battle of giants, or do you have a more optimistic worldview?
Which one? This one or this one? Does it matter?
You're okay. You want this, you're okay.
To answer this question is not possible at the moment.
For what reason?
For what reason?
Is it
because
balance of power?
Let's come to the balance of power or the equilibrium and to the new world order which is emerging, or the situation we are in at the moment is a kind of a transient, or we are in the transformation period. And of course, it affects the actors. And the main actors are known to us. It is definitely Beijing. It is definitely Washington. It is to a certain degree Moscow, and it is to a certain and smaller degree Brussels. Okay? The question is then, of course, how do they work and shape the new emerging world order? Will it be a peaceful world order, or will it be a confrontive world order? And I think there are different narratives given by the actors. There's, of course, the Russian narrative. Sergei knows much more about it than I do. It goes back to Yevgeny Primakov of the 90s, recently. And it has had the illusion, or let's say the very positive meaning and objective of bringing Russia, China, and India together in an alliance. If this would have happened, I think war and conflicts would have been very, very contained and limited.
So, Mr. Markedonov, if you want to take your position in that case, talking from a Russian view, do you think that we are, risking a World War III? Are we on the brink of that? Do you agree with Mr. Schultz that, it's a wait-and-see approach at this point in time?
Okay, thank you for the floor. I am a teacher. First of all, it's necessary to define the term. What do we mean speaking about the battle of giants? Battle like open war, or battle like confrontation and competition? If we will follow the second term, okay, we are seeing now the battle of giants in terms of competition or confrontation. We see the biggest confrontation in Europe after the end of the Cold War. I mean, here events in Ukraine. But at the same time, I am not a great champion to compare the Cold War and current situation, and I am not in favor of automatic application of previous historic terms to the current situation. A lot of differences. I agree with Peter that USA till nowadays, even taking into the account its continuing decline, is superpower number one. In the case of Russia, it's in lesser extent is engaged in this confrontation. Europe, yes, European arena, the post-Soviet space especially, the Middle East, but not Africa, not Latin America. Speaking about Russian worldview, it's necessary, I suppose, to differentiate the Russian foreign policy and Soviet one, because the current Russian foreign policy is not reduced USSR approach, by the way, because it's not ideological. It's first and foremost about national interests. It's more pragmatic. It's rather conservative. It's not about spreading of revolutionary ideas everywhere. It's about taking care of their interests.
So where do you see Russia's future place in the world? Because somewhat we only talk about US-China trade war at this point, and we don't really get the Russian stance.
Coming back to thesis of Evgeny Privakov, very popular now and in the 90s, I'm not sure that this union between China, Russia and India will be immediate. By the way, a lot of nuances exist. It's not about confrontation between these three parts, but nevertheless. And I suppose maybe we will have not grand battle or global battle. We will have confrontations and attempts to cooperate. Because in the case of US-Russia, we also try, in spite of confrontation, to see attempts to re-energize cooperation in Syria and Afghanistan, even in Ukraine, by the way.
Let's definitely hope we can avoid any confrontation. Mr. Massage, you recently wrote a bestseller book, The Dawn of Eurasia, on the trail of the New World Order. So what is the New World Order in your view?
The basic fact is the relative decline of the West. It's not an absolute decline. We continue to grow. We continue to develop new technologies in Europe, in the United States, continue to be very proficient at that. But it's certainly the case that this enormous gulf that existed between the West and the rest is disappearing. And it's not just China. China, of course, has the benefit of size, but if you go to a place like Indonesia, you see how the country now has, for example, 5 unicorns, startup companies that are valued at more than $1 billion. It's a country that has enormous dynamism, and you see that all over the world, even in parts of Africa. And that changes everything. Even the model of the Cold War is no longer applicable because these countries now have a margin of autonomy that they never had during the Cold War. They have access to capital, they have access to technology, they have even indigenous sources of capital and technology. It's a completely new world in that sense. We always have to go back to this idea that the last 300 years where the West was overbearingly dominant, that period is over.
Mr. Wang, the US has just raised the tariffs on Chinese products to 30% on October the 1st, the Chinese National Day. What's your take on the current situation? And do you think that the US will be able to halt, to a certain extent, China's rise?
Thank you for the question. It's actually a great time to talk about. Actually, this morning I saw the news that China-US has reached a partial deal, and so President Trump is going to halt, stop the increasing of the tariff.
But do you think that is just talking, or do you think that we will
actually
see real impact?
It's a good step to the right direction because no country. I mean, I'm sure President Trump, President Xi all felt the pressure that it's not sustainable to have this kind of situation deteriorated, which with uncertainty, with all the investment and business exchanges be disrupted, interrupted. But in terms of this topic of whether we're having a big battle of the giants, I think that given the last 75 years of the world since World War II, we are actually come to an age of it's impossible to have a military world war now because it will be mutually distrusted many times over if anybody dare to do that. But however, I see a new tendency is happening is that the world is starting to decouple now. We may not have the NATO and the Warsaw that maybe the old sense of economic, but we're probably seeing the emergence of economic NATO, economic Warsaw, that is happening. So there could not be a military war, but the war is already getting to the stage with the modern way of doing the war, like economic war, like the cyber war, tech war.
Technology
yeah,
war.
financial
I mean, this
war.
is what
yeah,
is
yeah, and also talent
the
war.
case with Huawei. Huawei is the best example for this technology war.
Absolutely.
So who is going to win that?
Exactly. So the danger of the world we are facing now, we are decoupling. We are divided into two systems now. And that two systems will probably have all these, the different measures being taken on combating each other on these new frontiers, which is it's the same as could not be that it's not maybe that devastating as a military war, but it's also tremendous backward. So the challenge is for us all, have all the wisdom how we can prevent that, how we can really find ways to strengthen the multilateralism. The UN has sustained us for, and all the other systems has sustained for 75 years. What's the next 75 years to sustain? How we can work together on that.
Mr. Katoj, do you agree with Mr. Wang that there are two systems now, and what's the place of India in this?
I think perhaps there are more than two systems. You see, at the one end you've got the United States, right? But at the other end you've also got a whole range of countries, right? You have Russia at one end, and then you have Europe. When you're looking at Europe, you're looking at a combined whole. And then I think these are the three major players. When you look at America as one, the Western supporters two, Russia as three, and then India is also trying to emerge there. The competition is going to get fiercer, but I think there will be great stretches of cooperation too in between these. I do not see any threat to the American position as of now, and I don't see that changing within the next 10 years. When we move towards, say, 2050, there may be a change. But then there are certain things which keep taking place on the world stage, which generally people don't take into account. And as a military man, I take that into account. And I think that the biggest threat which is really facing the world today is not what is being spoken of here, it is what is happening in the Gulf. Mm-hmm. And while we say that there may be shifts in the economic capabilities of countries, I would like to put it to you, what happens when there is a shift in the energy supply? What happens when the energy supplies in the Gulf get stopped? What happens? There are two countries which will not be impacted by an oil shock. One of them is the United States, and the second is Russia. Who will be impacted? Europe will be impacted, and then getting on to Asia. Japan, yes. China, yes. ASEAN, yes. India, yes. Now, these are what we call the gray rhino effects. It is not a black swan effect. We know it is there. Nobody is looking at it. And if this takes place, then I would like to posit here, it is the end of the Asian century, which we were speaking of yesterday. It will not take place, because the major players who are trying to get there will be impacted by energy which is not available, or which is available at a very high cost. The two countries which remain outside this purview remain the United States and Russia, and I believe there will be cooperation between the two on this particular issue.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Sakwa, balance of power is one of the oldest international theories. How far do you think we are away from an equilibrium at this point? And do you maybe agree on that with Mr. Katoj?
I think that great power politics is back, but the context in which it takes place is not what it was, say, before 1914, because it's embedded in an international system which has developed enormously since then. And very briefly, I just say it's got three levels. And the top level, which some people have already talked about, there is the whole multilateral system of international governance. That's the United Nations, Bretton Woods system, all of that, IMF, WTO. They're all under challenge, they've all got difficulties, yet they exist, and they do provide a framework. The second level is where we're talking about, where states compete, contest, they try to achieve hegemony, they try to achieve blocks and orders, and so on. And the third level, which we shouldn't forget, is the whole vast network of civil society, of popular movements. Today we see Extinction Rebellion, which is actually changing the way that this so-called great power politics, the battle of the giants, takes place in a different context. So these battle between states takes place in an international system which is constantly evolving and changing.
Bruno, so we had John Mearsheimer, of course, the very famous political scientist, already decades ago talking about bipolar and multipolar systems. Do you agree with Mr. Wang that we are moving more into a bipolar system again, or is it multipolar in the future?
It seems increasingly multipolar. we're seeing, for example, during the trade war, it was very difficult for the United States, let alone for China, to enroll other states with their own plans. Even Europe, of course, wants to develop its own autonomous foreign policy, and I think we will be successful with that. It may take 10 or 20 years, but you see the engines moving. All over the world, you don't see any appetite whatsoever for joining the United States and China in their particular disputation or conflict. Let me just say quickly about this idea of battle of giants. I agree with the concept, but I don't know if even in the program it is in quotes, battle of giants in quotes, because I think we all have the notion that there will be competition, there will be conflict, but it will not be military competition, and it won't be an existential struggle for survival. It will be something akin to a game, or akin to a great, as Donald Trump would say, a great TV show. What we see happening in the world today is not a deadly battle. It is a competition using technology, using trade, using infrastructure, using information, using culture. But always, I believe, within certain limits. And we saw that yesterday with the United States and China sort of walking back from the conflict that they've been developing.
So do you think that this technology competition is actually a stabilizing factor in itself? Because in the past, like after the Napoleonic War and World War I, we had the UK, which was basically the balancer, right? Making sure that there is relative peace, at least for a couple of years. Do you think that competition is now this stabilizing factor?
I think it is stabilizing. I think the greatest threat to peace is precisely the previous model, where you believe that the world is becoming homogeneous, all the same, and that is everyone is embracing a Western model. That's much more dangerous, and the instability we've seen over the past 20 years with Iraq and other cases comes from that. The idea that you have different poles that are competing with different limits, within limits, and that perhaps one of these poles, and the United States is the best candidate, could take up the role that the United Kingdom had in the 19th century of balancing power, being the offshore balancer. Is promising if we think about the format that the world system will take over the next 20, 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Markedanov, what do you think, who should be this balancer, and what could Russia's place and role be in that?
Okay. In your question, there is addressed to the times of Napoleon, 19th century, but that agenda was Eurocentric, by the way. No China, no India, no growing countries of the Asian Pacific area at that time to be taken into the account. Now we see the other situation. This is why I understand the idea of concert of great powers is so popular. Key actors gather together and formulate any steps towards or to confront and so on. But I suppose we can see situative concerts, not global one, because for example, in the Middle East, it's impossible to discuss a deal between US and Russia because Iranian interests are not identified with Russia, as they put it usually in the Western media. The same vice versa between Turkey and US, and proxies, of course. But Turkey and Saudi Arabia will have less interest to Ukraine. In Ukraine, we will see the other concert. European Union, its role would be incomparable with Middle East, for example, or Central Asia. We will see different region concerts, different alliances, different overlapping of interests. It's much more risky, but at the same time, it's not about the battle of giants or concert of great powers. A lot of smaller concerts, a lot of overlapping of interest, even between opponents. In one region, we can be opponents. On the other one, we can cooperate more or less.
Many more smaller alliances as well, but that could also in itself become a destabilizing factor. Professor Schultz, what do you say about that?
If we go back to theory of international relations, there are basically three models. One is a bandwagon model, one is a lone warrior model, and the other is an alliance or a neutral model. So, if we look back in the historical process of the 19th century, Sergei just named it, we saw 5 important actors in Europe, which created the stability and peace in Europe despite 2 wars. The one against France by Germany or Prussia, and the one by Prussia against Habsburg King Austria in 1866. So the whole system of multipolarity was very stable because it was based on the single factor that all the actors were relatively equal in economic power, military power, social cohesion. They shared the same religious beliefs, and they were even allied by family ties. This is not given anymore. We are living in a totally complex world, and therefore I think multipolarity, Bruno, has not a chance. Multipolarity would be, and I agree totally with my Chinese colleague, would be interlinked with bipolar elements. We have the bipolar elements already. In US-China relations, there are bipolar elements. In US-European relations, there are bipolar elements. And in US-Russia relations as well. So what keeps us together from going into bigger conflicts is actually what Sergei Karaganov always very pronouncedly put forward: deterrence. Deterrence is up to today an element of the Cold War, of the bipolar era, and keeps the global actors away from going to a very open and devastating and probably mankind-killing conflict. But this does not mean, as you asked in your first question, that we have proxy wars.
Let's talk about China here as well, because so far China has played a very peaceful role. Yeah. They have never, intervened into foreign affairs, and Xi Jinping obviously has a long-term plan, and with the Belt and Road Initiative and AIIB, more long-term thinking, right? And having lived in China, I understand the politics there pretty well. But how will the rise of China change things, and how will this impact this bipolar world?
I agree.
Excellent question. I think that today the problem I think we are facing now is the China has actually practiced a very unique model. I was listening to the previous panel discussion talking about China keep growth like average 7% for the last 7 decades, and so the magnitude, the size of China is already big enough. Every year is adding another Australia GDP to its country. So you can't expect China to always keep a high speed growth, but China is transforming, is diverting, only through this top-down and bottom-up approach, and also through the opening up and a very unique system. You have one consistent, dedicated party to really make sure the economic growth is the biggest legitimacy for its right in the power. So if they can deliver year after year, then China is really going to be making great contribution to the world. So, but the problem is that since China has a little different system than the other countries, people have this fear, people have do not understand, cannot accept. So the narrative we're seeing going on in the world these days is China bashing. It's become politically correct to bash China. So it's really the problem. You see, if China is doing so well, it will contribute to the world. China never invaded any other country. I mean, not in the history, not in the past 7 decades. Why cannot let us be coexistent and peacefully? So the challenge, I think, for the world and China today is that we are now in a very much dynamic and fast-changing world. So if we want to really cope with these newly threats like climate change, like these academic diseases, and also economic slowing down, China was the only country injected $4 trillion during the financial crisis. China was the only country that did not value its RMB during the Asian financial crisis. China has been very, very, very responsible stakeholder. Now China is launched a massive Belt and Road Initiative. Billions of dollars. Bruno is the expert on that now, and and China has set up AIIB to want to facilitate that. BRI is not perfect. It's still a bit bilateral. Let's make it multilateral. Let's make it a more strong mechanism. So I think that the world is we are not going to face in the collapse of the multilateral system. It's by new inventions, new adding values. And so on e-commerce, on the cyber, on the talent, on everything, let's have a new governance system to build it up. China can be a new player. So the old system needs upgrade. I'm not saying we're going to topple it. We're still going to maintain the U.S., the EU-led system, but let's improve it.
And the United States is still not
Yeah.
part, though, of the BRI,
That's right, but I'm
for
seeing
example.
what is doing U.S. now is dismantling everything, create TPP, the threat to create WTO, create the climate change and the nuclear intermediate treaties. I mean, he's basically create everything. And so, is this the U.S. we know that after Second World War? So if that vacuum is left, I think EU and China could probably feel part of that.
Let's ask Mr. Massar, so how should this new global governance structure and system look like and work?
It seems to be going in the direction of different kinds of globalization, multiple globalizations. Belt and Road is a Chinese model of globalization, and you have a Western model, and you'll have other countries like India trying also to have a certain vision about globalization. And then the question will be, how do we harmonize all these systems, and how do you prevent them from entering into conflict? I think that the Belt and Road is a positive contribution. Not so much, by the way, because of the money and investment that it contributes to the world economy, but because of the openness that it contributes to the world system. China is more open to the world with the Belt and Road than it would be without it, and that's a good thing. What the Belt and Road now is doing is clearly awakening other players that had become too self-centered, the European Union and the United States, and they're both developing alternatives. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in a conference in Brussels where very clearly, it wasn't put in these terms, but it was very clear that the European Union made the first step in launching a rival to the Belt and Road.
Well, and Europe is in a difficult spot because it's kind of sandwiched between China and the US. So does Europe have to decide which direction it goes to in the future?
Yes, so that's the question I have for Peter. If the world system is going to be a bipolar system, where do we place Europe and where do we place Russia? Because I personally am very skeptical that we can align Europe with the United States and Russia with China. I see no evidence of that. By the way, in the case of Russia as well, I don't see Russia interested in building a formal alliance with China. And that's, I think, one reason that we have to be skeptical about the idea of a bipolar system. But, and I think we'll come back to this, old instruments like the United Nations no longer work.
And India, the biggest democracy in the world. So there is a very interesting book by Jared Diamond who basically predicts that every 100 years, every century, there is a new world power, and he says that after China, it's going to be India. So long-term thinking, Mr. Katouch, what is India going to do with its rising power?
You see, I think the Prime Minister has made it very clear, and that has been his refrain from 2014 onwards, that when India looks at growth and when India looks at the international model, it looks at sustainability for all. It was said yesterday also, the same statement was made yesterday, that there can be no standalone model by which you're looking at an Indian growth story which doesn't take along the rest of the world. So when the Prime Minister made his statement and he was talking with ASEAN, he made it very clear that it is a growth for all. And when we talk about the Indian Ocean region, and we have that acronym called SAGAR. SAGAR is the Hindi for the oceans, and SAGAR also means sustainability and growth for all in the region. Now, I think that has been a consistent philosophy as far as the Indian system is concerned, that you cannot have growth for one at the expense of the other, because in the long run, it will not be sustainable. There was also this question which had been brought about as far as the BRI was concerned, and why India is not part of it. Now, obviously, India cannot be part of it because it goes through a very important component of the BRI is the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And the start point of that corridor actually goes through Indian territory, which is illegally occupied by another country. So for anybody, least of all China, to expect India going to be party to that is really not part of it. But there are also other concerns. Besides, this is a major concern, and because of this particular concern, India is not going to be part of the system, regardless of anything.
India will not become part of the BRI?
It is out. It is out, and I'm stating so openly. But there are other concerns also. You see, the BRI does not follow international standards of transparency, sustainability, openness, and the rule of law. And it's important to note that during the second BRI forum, which was held in April 2019, President Xi said that he would address these concerns. But actually, those concerns still have not been addressed.
And nothing has happened. So, Mr. Wang, what do you reply to Mr. Katuj in that case? Could there be cooperation? Because that is, according to Mr. Xi, win-win situation, right? That would be a big goal to get India on board.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that India is a great partner. I mean, President Xi is in India, just visiting India today and yesterday. And I think that, Belt and Road is only launched about 6 years. It's a 50 years, 100-year project. It's the continental, connection between, basically the whole world. So since the Marshall Plan, we never had a big, gigantic plan. Like a Belt and Road initiative that China is willing to put forward. So Belt and Road is really a venture capital project. China put the seeds money, let's have A round, B round, C round, let's everybody contribute. So the key is now to have this multilateralized BI. So let's have, let's set up an international committee for BI. Let's have international secretary office for BI. Let's have an international, arbitration center for BI. So there's many things can be done. So I think the way with India is that, India and China are the two largest economy, and it's a neighbor. It's have a 2.5 billion population. It's enormous. I think there's a way to collaborate. I think the way with Pakistan is that, of course, they are the country who discussed the first. But let's talk with India, and then if there's anything wrong with that one, let's correct that. Let's improve that. So that's why President Xi said it's a jointly consulted, jointly built, and jointly benefit. That's the principle of BI. So it's not that China have dominated on that. It's really through consultation. So there are many success stories. There's also unsuccess stories. But let's work on the good ones. Let's improve it. Let's have international discussion, and let's get BI more beneficial to the world.
That's an offer for negotiations with India. There is an interesting book on Russia, Mr. Sakwa, that was published by Angela Stan this February. Its title is Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. So where do you see Russia will head to when it comes to BRI initiatives and China and India? What is Russia's position?
Defends what I could call the international system, the system of global governance, sovereign internationalism. Its position is very conservative, if you like, old-fashioned sovereign state.
And will it stay like this?
Yeah, but at the same time aligned with China in particular, and just to question slightly what Bruno said, I think the depth of the Russo-Chinese alignment is not an alliance, absolutely right, it's not a bloc, it's anti-bloc politics and so on, yet the alignment with China is of a depth and intensity which is unprecedented. Just last week, Putin revealed that the Chinese nuclear weapons come under the anti-ballistic missile space of Russia. This is an extraordinary depth of trust between two states. Also, it brings in India as well as part of what you could call this anti-hegemonic alignment. It's not anti-Western, it's not anti-American even more. It's actually trying to state a different form of international politics, a sort of which you've both have just alluded to, in which there is no dominant power which considers itself the order given of the world. And the emphasis in that book and so on is to ensure that these institutions of international society, the United Nations above all, but with WTO, so it's not against the West, against the rest, it's aligning of a different type of politics. And I think this is the depth of that. I don't think people in the West have fully understood that there's sort of talk, a community of common destiny. People dismiss it as just a word and a phrase. It's not. It's actually a type of politics which is taking beyond this sort of new Cold War battle of giants. What sort of giants are we talking about? It's not just states, it's economic powers, military-industrial complexes. There's a lot of things going on, and Russia's trying to put forward with its, as I said, not alignment, it's an alignment, not allies. Just one other thing, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we heard a little bit about it yesterday. It's actually also developing, I mean, again, it's weak, it's all sorts of issues and tensions within it, yet it's provided a framework for China and India to get closer than they have done since India became independent. I mean, it's quite an astonishing depth of this alignment, which the West As I said, it's not anti-West, it's not even post-West. It's actually beyond what we've seen before, beyond the West.
Mr. Markedonov, so in 10, 20 years down the road, will Russia still be a global power? What kind of future place do you see for Russia in the world? Because it has a lot of economic and social political problems at home as well.
Good question, by the way. I hope Russia will follow, first of all, its interests. As for global power, there are some problems to be a global power comparable with US or China in terms of economy. First of all, economic growth, economic situation is the most important vulnerability of Russia, not military potential. Military potential is, helps to consider Russia nowadays as a superpower. Coming back to the question on the title of the book, I know Professor Sand well and respect her, but I suppose it's so usual for the United States scholar to simplify situation, to portray it like by a bicolored picture. It's much more complicated. First of all, Russia is the part of the Western world. Which city is the biggest in Europe? Moscow. Which nation is the biggest in terms of population in Europe? Russia. 80% of our population is concentrated in European part. Yes, Russia has vast Asian territories, but it's a part of Europe. And of course, Russia is interested to be part of the European security. Now we see what's the problem with confrontation between Russia and the West is dissatisfaction with European security identified with NATO security.
But Professor Schultz, for example, has Russia not isolated itself so much over the last couple of years with Ukraine, with Syria, all these hotspots in the world?
It is isolated, and it's not isolated at all. I think Vladimir Putin has had a mission, and he fulfilled the mission. To speak, to take up an American slogan, he brought Russia back in from the cold. Russia is now an actor in international politics, which it was not after the demise and the collapse of the Soviet Union for 10 years. So from 2000 onwards, by external developments like the increase of economic activity in Asia, the Russian economy boomed, 7.5 growth rates points per average up to 2009, and then came a different development, but they are now back. And at the same time as well, the separatism was taken care of in Russia, and a kind of stable society developed, homogenized. Infrastructure was relatively terrible in the Soviet times and in the 90s, of course. But if you go now even into the provinces of Russia, you find very modern airports, highways, and buildings, renovation of cities, and so forth and so forth. So basically, in a way, under the first 2 years of Putin's being as a president up to 2008, and then from 2012 onwards up to 2024, probably the last year he is in office, Russia is an actor again. What will be the problem of Russia? And I think I agree totally with Sergei. The next president of Russia must look at the innovation of the society, at the economy, to bring Russia apart from energy and raw material resources into the world market with competitive, qualitative products. And this is very difficult.
And will it manage? Because so far we don't really talk in other countries about Russia's innovative power, like AI, data technology, blockchain, and so on. But you live in Russia, so what is happening on the ground? Do you see promising indicators?
It would be naive for me to make promises right now, like Russia will be power number one. Of course, it would be pleasant for me to see my country as the leader in the world, but a lot of obstacles exist, a lot of challenges exist also, but I suppose it's a real challenge and a real alternative to be among leaders, or to see for the competition or battles of the other giants, by the way.
We need to talk, of course, about Brexit as well, and I would like to move to that topic with you, Mr. Massage. What will it change for the integration of Europe going forward? And how do you see the bigger picture when it comes to Britain leaving the European Union?
I don't think we regard Brexit as the momentous world historical event that we thought it might be 3 years ago.
Will the European Union survive, do you think?
Yes, I mean, it's obvious that, in fact, Brexit had a stabilizing effect. Many other countries that were flirting with the idea of leaving the European Union have left that behind. I think Martin Schultz yesterday made that point, and it's a good point. Italy, Poland, they now regard the process of exiting the European Union so difficult and so turbulent that they would rather prefer to stay and try to change the European Union from the inside. So I think it could end up having positive consequences in the sense that if you want to develop a real political union in Europe with a common foreign policy, a genuine common foreign policy, it's better not to have the UK there because the UK would never be on board for that. We're still having problems. The German-French relationship has seen better days, and I think we have to move beyond that, the German-French axis. But in a way, it is a very promising moment. For me, the decisive change has been a change of spirit, of mindset, which is represented by the statement by the incoming Commission President that the next Commission will be a geopolitical Commission and that the EU will become a geopolitical EU. Now, I don't know if my friends around the table from India, from Russia, from China take this seriously or not, but I take it seriously. I think we will see over the coming 1 or 2 decades a much more geopolitical European Union than before.
We don't hear a lot about India's position when it comes to the European Union and what kind of, views you have on this whole Brexit story. So share your perspective, Mr. Katuj, when it comes to Brexit.
Yeah. When you look at Brexit, I think there is, as of now, great turbulence within the Union itself. Because when Britain moves out, it does create certain disturbances. Let's also remember Britain is a very major military power. And when that military power goes out, it to that extent weakens the Union. And the Union will have to do something to build up its own military capability internally. As far as India is concerned, we have good relations with the European Union. And we also have good relations, or we'll say excellent relations with Britain. Our problem with the EU is really basically when we are looking at on the trade front. That India is much more used to bilateral exchanges. So when we deal with France, it is on a bilateral level. When we deal with Germany, it's on a bilateral level. When we deal with the UK, it's on a bilateral level. And we have really not been able to get on to dealing with the European Union as a single entity because on economic issues in the EU, they all have to come on board as one grouping for you to do business with. I think that is still a work in being, and it will take some time. As of now, I think India will continue to deal with countries on the economic front on a bilateral basis rather than on an EU basis.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Sakwa, so 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Russia-EU relations, they've seen ups and downs, right? How do you see the future of the bilateral relations?
It's been ups and downs, but the trend has been downwards, and we're in a pretty low point now.
And how bad can it get from now on?
Well, as Dimitri Trenin says, it'll get worse before it gets worse. And I'm afraid that's the thing. I'm going to agree with Bruno. The Brexit change will open new opportunities for the European Union. We already see closer defence talks, possibilities. The great speech of Macron at the end of August to diplomats, which is perhaps the most important speech of a European political leader in the last 10 years, in which he said many things, but 2 things are important. He said that no major economic, security or other European issue can be resolved without Russia's participation. Now, that's a fundamental change in thinking after 5 years of new Cold War. Within that framework, once again, ideas of greater Europe are back. And what we now see is an opportunity for a new, rebooted, genuine European continentalism, pan-continentalism, as opposed to the traditional, the 30 years after the war, which has seen, which I'll talk about later, the enormous boost to Atlanticism, which is, nothing bad. It's perhaps done many good things, but it's time perhaps to move on. And in that framework, the European Union will perhaps integrate more deeply, at the same time within a continental framework in which Russia becomes a genuine partner, not as it were on sufferance, as it were a guest to a party which started long before it joined, but actually as a founder member of a new community. And that's what they really wanted after 1989. And this is what Gorbachev wanted, Yeltsin wanted, Putin wanted, and I'm sure the successor wants it. And I think there's absolutely no reason why Europe should not find a formula. We can do it. A formula in which continentalism, in partnership with the United States, India, China, and so on, but in part a new type of relationship on the continent.
But then the question is whether Putin will actually seize this opportunity and see this window of opportunity as well. So do you think that he will take initiative, or is it more the camp of the European Union that needs to take a more proactive approach when it comes to Russia?
Okay, in Russia, the situation with Brexit is considered like closure of one set of the problems and opening of the other one. On the one side, frankly speaking, there is not so kept especially happiness, because it's symbolic demonstration of the stop of so-called successism, because every steps after the Berlin Wall was considered in Europe and manifested in Europe like success. The Balkans, some other points, the enlargement of NATO and the enlargement of European Union. In Russia, there was another attitude. This is why it's stop of the successism or progressism. On the other side, it established a lot of problems, because UK will not be counterbalanced by European Union institutions in terms of military development, in terms of economy, political decision making. This country could be closer to the United States. Will it so good for Russia? Will it great advantage for Russia? I am not sure. This is why it's necessary to understand that this situation opens the other ways, other problems. It's not the end of the history, of course, in European part of the globe, and it's necessary to treat the situation in different ways.
Mr. Wang, what kind of new multilateral mechanisms do we need? Because we see that the WTO, NATO, a lot of these organizations are basically losing their power, right? You mentioned China's position, the BRI, AIIB, a lot of new initiatives taking place right now. But what kind of global institutions should we put into place, not just reforming the United Nations, but coming up maybe with new multilateral organizations, and how to make sure that it's not just China, but China works with other partners as well?
Yes, this is a hard question, but I think talking with the UK Brexit, and we see actually in the recent last 10 years. A big trend shift, the paradigm shift. And now we see multilateralism is basically collapsing somewhat. Brexit is a good example of that. And we see WTO, all those things are under threat. But what we can really put forward, I think we need an upgrade and innovation and creativity. So the concept, the geopolitical concept of East and the West is outdated. We are all share the future of the mankind. Basically, we are all in the same boat. So if we're going to survive for the next 75 years, we have to really work together. So in order to do that, I think we need to really innovate the existing global system. We cannot top it. We cannot really, start from scratch. Let's build on existing global system. So instead, I think EU and we have quite a few blocks now, Russian and China. So that's why I think that BRI is a good initiative. It's a good multilateral initiative. So that let's work together. So the Marshall Plan has led the European prosper for the last 7 decades. Can we have a BRI to drive the world for the next 7 decades of some prosperity? So economically, so let's get World Bank, ADB, AFDB, all the development banks, and AIIB, which is a multilateral platform already there, work together. Have they jointly work on the Belt and Road. So let other countries get together. And then this is one area on that. On the WTO, let's really have to put the act quickly. For example, the appellate body is going to be paralyzed by the end of the year. I was in Geneva just 3 days ago. So our think tank, Center for China Globalization, we organized together a seminar at WTO where Chinese WTO ambassador, EU ambassador, 10 country ambassador attended. I give a keynote there. Talk about how can we anti-plastic pollution. Let's get the lower hanging fruit, get WTO have some consensus, see the WTO in action, really making progress. Otherwise, it's become a chatting house. We can't do anything. So I think this is one area. Another area I think we should really strengthen is that if WTO is still contemplating what next moves, if 164 countries cannot decide what to do, let's get the other RCEP, which is a big one, including India and everybody, Japan, ASEAN. TPP is already in action. It's great. It's upgraded a mini WTO. CCG is promoting China to be part of the TPP. So let's get all those multilateral in working. So if we have a new infrastructure revolution that's going to connect the world, and then we have a new trading upgradation with all the standards like investment, technology, data flow, environment protection, and labor rights. Let's get the TPP, expanded. So, it's not the end of the world, but we really to get out of this contradiction of East and West, and we have to fight, and so that's not good. I think that I still see the economic connectivity is the guarantee of the peace and prosperity for the next 70 years. Just like WTO did, just like the UN did, like a multilateral system that guarantee we did not have a military hot war. We are going to build up this multilateral system, preventing we're having an economic hot war. Let's not go into that trend, and let's really work hard to build this common future of mankind. Thank you.
And China working with India as well. I would like to talk a little bit about the geopolitical tensions, though, as well. The World Economic Forum, in its 2019 report, said that geopolitical tensions are the biggest risk to the world and the world order. You have a military background, Mr. Katouche, so where do you see the biggest hotspots when it comes to geopolitics in the next couple of years?
When people have been talking about hotspots, Afghanistan obviously comes into mind, and the happenings, when the other hotspot is Iraq and Syria, and then we have conflicts in certain parts of Africa. It is also presumed that there'll be a hotspot in Kashmir between Pakistan and India, but I do not think that these are not going to be major concerns. I still believe what I said initially. Our major concern lies in disruption of energy supplies from the Gulf. We've had the Iranian ships being attacked. We've had ships being taken hostage. We've had the Saudi oil facilities being attacked, and 50% of the supplies being disrupted for, I believe they just got them back into order, but for at least a month or so. And now, after that, we've had Saudi Arabia being attacked by the Houthis, 3 brigades worth, as per reports, of troops getting out. And just yesterday, we had an Iranian ship being attacked, right, by 2 missiles at 0500 hours and 0520 hours. Now listen, let us not put these things under the carpet. What happens if this supply gets disrupted? It doesn't matter what you talk about, that the economies are we going to have a unipolar world or a multilateral world? I think it's going to be a totally different world. Because if these supplies get disrupted, then the Asian economies are the ones which are going to be really badly hit. And if the Asian economies are hit, then it doesn't really matter what happens, because everybody will take the blow after that. So I think what a message which could go out from a forum like this is that the world body needs to pay very particular attention to the Straits of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb, right, to see that these sea lanes remain open and that the energy supplies are not hindered. Now, who is playing this game? I'm not going to get into who's done it. That, of course, I presume will come out after 10, 20 years. But ultimately, the only 2 countries which are not seriously impacted and which will gain is, as I said, Russia and America. So the rest of the world is going to go down. And I think this is going to be, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest concern when you look into the next 2 to 3 years at least.
We are taking 10 minutes of Q&A in a moment, but I would just like to close this panel together with one final question, which is on the topic of this panel. I would like to invite each of you to answer in 1 or 2 words. Mr. Markedonov, first of all, in your geopolitical worldview, who will win the battle of the giants? You can name one or none at all.
Coming back to my initial thesis, I don't think we see clear battle of giants with very clear blocks or coalitions around them and so on, like in the period of Cold War. And I don't think the victory will be something more than Pyrrhus victory, by the way.
All winners or all losers? Mr. Schultz?
Battle of giants. If Europe gets its act together, it will be a geopolitical player. But I don't see it for the next decade. But not alone. We have to normalize, to put on a pragmatic, moderate basis our relationship with Russia. And Europe, European Union and Russia together can be an actor of shaping in a peaceful, prosperous way the development of the new world order.
Mr. Wang.
Well, I really think that the multilateralism will win, the inclusive globalization will win, and that humanity will prevail.
Well, if there is a battle of giants, who is the super giant that keeps the giants in their place and within limits? And I think if we look at the world today, it's not the United States, it's not the United Nations, it's not China. It is, to a considerable extent, technology, technological forces, and market forces, investment, economic growth. Usually when you see each of these giants retreating from confrontation, it's because they are worried about the economic and technological consequences. So perhaps we are entering a world where some form of artificial intelligence will be in charge, and all these giants are in fact not the real giant.
A robot is going to win the battle of giants. Mr. Katoch?
In my view, I think we are heading towards multilateralism. For the moment, I don't see any decline in US position, at least for the next decade or decade and a half. But after that, we will have various poles coming up. You will have China, you will have Russia, you will have the EU, you will have Japan, you will have India. And each of them will be major players in their own right, and with no one particular pole in a position to dominate the rest.
And you see, we have consensus between China and India. It's multilateralism. Fantastic. Mr. Sakwa.
I think that we ought to be honest that we messed up at the end of the Cold War, and that 30 years ago we didn't manage to establish a working peace order. I think we now have an opportunity to do so. That things are moving, the moving parts. We had 30 years more or less of the shadow of the last Cold War. I think we now have an opportunity in which we can actually move beyond giantism, if you like, and to allow indeed genuine these institutions that no one owns, the institutions of global governance. They belong to humanity along with their normative values. And if we can make sure that big countries, giants and midgets and small ones in between can all own that, then I think we've got an opportunity to get that peace order which we failed to do after 1989.
And on this positive note, we have 10 minutes of Q&A. So there are 3 housekeeping rules. First of all, state your name, your organization. Then second, keep your answer short and just one question, please. And third, please mention the name of the person you would like to ask. There's one question here in the front. One after the other, please. Yes.
Mohammed Sharqawi from Al Jazeera Center for Studies. Whether it's a bipolar or multipolar world, I believe that geopolitics remains a dynamic construct. So we may imagine Washington, Moscow, or Beijing calling the shots and solidifying their status of superpowers. But I am cautious about the risk of perpetuating what I would consider a classical concept of power, superpowers, balance of power, giants, something that we have inherited maybe from the 80s. So I see now the world where these big giants cannot do much unless they have some regional or local partner. Back in 2010, Russia embraced BRICS. Now we are looking at Russia embracing Turkey, Iran. The United States is reconsidering its alliance with some Gulf states. So my question in short to the panelists, what do you make of this emerging superpower, regional power structure to solidify what these so-called giants would like to do. In other words, we cannot see the singularity. It's the multiplicity of actors within this construct of superpowers.
Who on the panel would you like to ask the question?
Anyone,
If you have to pick
anyone.
one volunteer?
No volunteers.
Mr. Mark Kedanov, would you like to answer that question?
In one of my previous statements, I especially stress about not one concert of powers, but concerts. In those concerts, superpower addressed to the regional powers, because without them, no possibility to enforce or to promote interest even. We see it in the Middle East. As for coalitions, I don't believe in clear and sustainable coalitions. Yeah, we are discussing the problems of cooperation between Turkey, Iran, and Russia in the Middle East, but a lot of nuances between them. It's impossible to say about complete consensus between Iran and Russia. On Israel, for example, Russia is needed to cooperate with Israel, and it's not the matter for the Iranian interests, and so on. This is why rather situative coalitions or alignments, not clear alliances, by the way.
Or what we call in international relations theory, rapprochement as well, right, between different countries. Professor Schultz, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, what we have not discussed here is the white elephant. And the white elephant is not anymore a monolithic power. There's an incredible debate going on in the States between the political foreign policy establishment in the Congress and the new President of the United States. And if you remember what he just said on the 24th of September at the United Nations Assembly, the future does not belong to the globalists. There will be a neo-isolationism or national politics, and they will be implemented as long as we have this president in power, or maybe in another term as well, or a different one with similar ideas. So this will influence, of course, the shape of multilateralism, the shape, if we go towards a multipolar world, in what kind, not in the old form of the 19th century, definitely not. I think Bruno mentioned in technology. Technology is driving the process, but it is implemented by political forces. And here I think I have my doubts that we can come to a kind of a situation, as Sergei described it, that we will have multiple alliances and so forth. We will have basically a kind of a split of the world political system, not called East and West. There is a split, and the split is very clearly defined by Washington and by Beijing, and the only two capitals in between is Brussels and Moscow. Do they come together? Then there can be a mediator, if they have the political will and if they are restructuring themselves, with the help, of course, of India, Pakistan, and what we call now the Greater Eurasia developing.
We have one question there in the back and then one here in front.
My name is Behruz from TUC Research Institute Berlin, and I've got one question for Mr. Makais. And the question is, what is Eurasia? Does Eurasia mean Russia, Greater Russia? And what is the concept of, what Russia means by the concept of Greater Eurasia? Thank you.
Who would you like to ask?
I think it's me.
Puno.
Well, there are about 8 or 10 concepts of Eurasia today in the world. Someone should write an article detailing all 8 or 10. My concept, which I think is the easiest to defend, is the combination of Europe and Asia as a whole. I think this is the big question of the future. What shape will Eurasia in this sense take? Because we know the United States will continue to be a superpower. We'll know that China will be a superpower. What we don't know is where will Russia be? Where will the European Union be? How will they relate to China? Will China become hegemonic over the whole of Eurasia? All these are questions about the future shape of Eurasia. Now, in Russia, I was in Valdai last week. Even in Valdai, it's very much under the influence of Sergei Karaganov, even there are 2 or 3 concepts of Eurasia. Sometimes it seems that it's Russia and China together. this alliance between the two. Other times it seems that it's the whole of Europe and Asia, but excluding parts of the European Union. They seem to be divisive concepts. We should have a more comprehensive and inclusive concept. I think the idea of Eurasia is we get rid of this separation between Europe and Asia, which is so outdated and which creates so many problems.
We have two more questions, first over there, and then she will walk to you, sir. Gentleman in the back, please.
Hi, good morning. It's Kim Helmgard from USA Today. My question is for Mr. Wang. I was wondering if you could give an assessment of the deal or the partial deal that was announced in Washington last night, and specifically, you know, are we justified in calling it a partial deal, given that so many of the frictions are unresolved, the bigger substantive ones to do about, you know, China's trade policy or you know, technology transfer and so on. And related to that, can you give some insight into the Chinese perspective on Mr. Trump as a reliable negotiator, given that he has had, you know, there's been so many reversals, climate, Iran, now what we're seeing in Turkey and Syria, etc.?
Yeah, no, this is a timely question. I think that you know, both China and the U.S. having this trade war is not really justified. I mean, Trump is using the 20th century concept to measure the 21st century trade practice. For example, you know, since China opened up, there's about 70,000 U.S. companies set up in China. They generate, you know, 700 to 900 billion revenue in China, much larger than the trade deficit. Apple is made in China, you know, selling for $1,000 in the U.S., and China makes about $50 for each set. And but then all the deficit, all the surplus was counted on China. So the way is really not correct. And also, the export to the U.S. from China, half of that was made by the U.S. companies. You know, GM and Ford sells more cars in China than the United States. China is Apple's second largest market. Walmart purchased 30% from China to calm down the inflation in the U.S. So all the good benefit is not there, but the narrative is not there. So that's why Trump is using this old concept, the goods movement, or we have this huge deficit. So I think he's really answering the populism that getting him into the power. So I think that this kind of a tactic cannot sustain. He has met a lot of opposition from business community, consumers. He cannot sustain. The Christmas is coming. He cannot put that high tariff so that all his voters will suffer. So I think it's wise for him to really stop. It's good also for China. China can't also linger in there, have this uncertainty around. So I think the way to get out of that, I think it's really good that they have a partial agreement. Basically, it's a ceasefire, as a matter of fact. And continuously they will talk. And then there's one thing that I think U.S. can really focus. China just passed an foreign investment law. In that, it stipulates should not do the forced technology transfer, no violation of IPR. All foreign companies should be treated equal. And the implementation detail of that, as President Xi said at the Osaka G20, will come on January 1st. This addresses all the structural problems. So let's focus on that, and then let's solve, you know, create a more open environment. Chinese wants to do that. But it's not, we're not going to have a perfect deal, but I think any deal is good, and let's calm down, let the stock market calm down, let's build up the confidence, let incrementally increase the good sentiment for the environment, and let's hope we'll solve this issue.
We have one final question, then we have closing remarks. Just briefly, sir.
Thank you, sir. I am T.K.S. Ilangovan, a member of parliament from India. See, in the middle of 19th century, the war was between capitalism and communism. The USA stood for capitalism and the USSR represented communism. India and other few countries had to form a new unit called non-aligned meat.
And your question, please, sir?
Yeah. But now, the two major economic players, one India and China, whatever they produce, their economic growth will be for self-consumption because of the population you consider. We cannot support other countries. Both the countries cannot support other countries. In this context, it will be a war of trade and it cannot be otherwise. What is your opinion? Anybody can explain to me, sir. If I am wrong also, I want to learn.
Who is your question to, sir? Who would you like to ask? Mr. Wang? Okay.
No, if I understand your question correctly, I think that, as Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter if it's white cat or black cat as long as it catches mice. India and China has somewhat different models. But if we can really constantly dedicate to the improving the livelihood of the people, that's the largest legitimacy. So if we can deliver economic performance, and if we can contribute to the world GDP growth and welfare of the people, I think that should be allowed. Of course, the end of history is outdated. So let's have some diversified history, diversified format, so that India, China, ASEAN, EU, US, Russian, let's have a multipolar model, so that in the end, we don't know which is probably perform better. So it's a hybrid. China is a hybrid itself. It had 80% private sector, 20% probably SOE, or another 10% multinational. But the hybrid may work. China is not totally communism, it's not totally capitalism. So maybe let's get the best of everything, and that's a lesson for the world, is how we can, black and white. There's no black-white world. It's always mixed. It's a colorful world.
And as you said, we all sit in the same boat, and let's hope that this ship is going into the right direction. We have closing remarks, just very briefly to wrap the session up, and I give the word to Professor Charalambos Tsardanidis, Professor at the Department of Mediterranean Studies at the University of the Aegean. Thank you so much, sir. Do we have a microphone for Professor, or you take that one? Fantastic.
Thank you very much. I'll try to make some concluding remarks after this fruitful and very stimulated discussion from three perspectives. The first one will be from the perspectives of geopolitics, the second from geoeconomics, and the third of the nature of the emerging world system, and focusing on the balance of power. The first conclusion could be that from geopolitical perspective, that we are moving from the geopolitical significance of the Euro-Atlantic world, which was the basis of the world system since the Second World War, to the geopolitical significance of the Pacific. And that, I mean, the areas of East Asia, the United States, and Russia to some extent. And of course, that doesn't mean, as some of the discussion point out, that there is a decline of the West. There is a relative decline of the West due to many factors. One, perhaps, for Europe is the demographic decline of Europe. The second conclusion refers to geoeconomics. It seems that from the globalization discussion and multilateralism, to some extent, perhaps incrementally, we are moving towards to geoeconomics, from geopolitics to geoeconomics, in different forms. Some, they pointed out the emergence of a new economic bipolarism between China and the United States. Others, perhaps, are referring to the creation of mega-regions, which could play a relatively significant role. Perhaps we could add to this the significance of the economy of the cities, which in some regions start to play a very important role. For example, Singapore or Hong Kong. And by this, we could say that we are moving from military confrontation towards economic competitiveness. And many, they refer to the technological battles, to new issues of economic competition. And third, the third conclusion perhaps refers to the nature of the world system and the balance of power. Shall we have conflict or cooperation? It was one of the main questions. And it seems that many agree that we are moving from the issue of military competitiveness towards forms of cooperation, I think we have to underline the word connectivity, which it is used now. For example, the dialogue between China and Europe and the policy of the European Union is based on connectivity. And also, but on the other hand, it is there is other problems of conflict in this framework. For example, it has been referred about the energy security and the energy competition, which perhaps will bring many powers to a conflict. Of course, one characteristic of the New World System, which is a paradox, that the most supportive states for globalization during the last 30 years were the European Union and the United States. Now we see that the most consistent supporter of globalization and multilateralism is China, which tries through its soft power, through emerging economic power, to point out that multilateralism and globalization is a good thing for the world.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your participation, for your concluding remarks. That's the end of the session. We're going to move to an award ceremony to happier times now. Thank you so much for your time and expertise.